Hey everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. Today we're going to talk a bit about how social media is broken. That's not a particularly controversial idea, as I'm sure everyone on this panel would agree. But I think in recent years, particularly in recent months, to some people, social media's problems are manifesting on a society level scale, and obviously that's an even bigger problem than before. From stuff like deadly COVID misinformation to white supremacists organizing militias online, even stuff like harassment that's been around for ages. All of this stuff is kind of coming to a head this year. And so it's a conversation we wanted to have. And the other side of the coin, I think it is possible to imagine something better. If social media is broken, there's bound to be a way to fix it. And if not, bound to be a way to build something that's better. So that's kind of where we want to kick off the conversation today. And on that note, Naj, I would love to start my first question by asking you a little bit about your projects. You have two things going on, Ethel's Club and Somewhere Good. Both are communities built by and for people of color.
Yes.
And they sound like really special places, and they start with a really different idea than traditional huge social media platforms. So I'd love to know a little bit about what you think regarding the question, if social media platforms need to be smaller to be better. Do they need to be small? Do they need to be custom built for communities? Is size important here?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I think the most important thing that social platforms should do moving forward in the future, and something that we're super focused on, is just being super intentional to start. So being intentional about size, about our framework, about foundational aspects of what the product is delivering to the end user. One of the aspects that was really important to us when we got started was size. And so one of the factors of Somewhere Good is kind of connecting people with smaller, more intimate communities, because people tend to behave better in smaller networks. One of the things that we use in our product meetings to kind of base a lot of our decisions off of is mimicking a real life dinner party. Who would you invite to that party? How do people interact when they're in those kinds of smaller, intimate spaces? It tends to, again, be a lot more aligned with better behavior. And that's our perspective in terms of the many ways in which social networks can sort of be more user-friendly in a multitude of ways.
That's really interesting. Obviously, Ethel's Club began as an offline community, right? It was founded pre-COVID, and then you kind of had to transition it into being an online community, which is a really unusual story, I think, and maybe a lesson for other social networks.
Yeah, we had to make the decision in about 3 hours. It was March 12th of last year, so we're coming up on a year. And it kind of answered the same problem, which was that in the physical spaces that people were visiting pre-COVID, it was still sort of this, like, you kind of go into a space and it was a white empty box and you didn't have that familiarity. And so even with Ethel's Club, the physical location in Brooklyn, we built it out so that it necessitated smaller, more intimate interactions with our members. And so we took that same little nugget of knowledge and used it digitally. And Somewhere Good is now our technology platform that allows us to build that out on a much larger, faster scale, but still with that level of intention that people want to be connected in a more intimate manner with one another.
Something really interesting about your project that I think fits into a broader conversation we're going to have here, we might get a bit into policy and other stuff that's going on politically with tech platforms, is the idea that it is, custom built from scratch and it's small. And like the big conversation right now in tech is, do we need to break up big tech? Is big tech the problem? Is it the problem that it's big? Jesse and Rashad, I'd be really curious to know what you think about like this idea that you could build social networks from this completely different place. And is this like part of what's made social networks today so toxic and created all these problems?
I can take the first crack, I guess. I think what Naj said about intentionality is so important. And I think I do think that these platforms have gotten too big. I mean, Facebook, for example, it's all built theoretically around community, but you just can't really have a community of 3 billion people. That's just not really how communities work. But I think that part of it is about intentionality. I mean, there are platforms, for example, I'm sure Snapchat has plenty of issues, but it was designed with a certain intentionality. And you don't see stories about Snapchat being overrun by misinformation, even though it is a large platform. And that's just because it was fundamentally designed with intentionality in a way such that you're not just being shown algorithmically recommended and amplified, or get posts from whoever based on virality. It was built in a way where they were clear-minded about how they wanted people to be interacting and what the app was supposed to do. And so I think Naj makes such a good point about, like, if you have that intentionality from the beginning, I think everything else can flow from there. Whereas if your goal is just growth at any cost, you're going to end up with all sorts of problems.
I mean, I would agree with all of that. I think what's important, right? I live in New York City, right? I live in Manhattan. You go down the street in Manhattan, you see all sorts of buildings. Some are really big, some are really small. And some are, in between, right? And there's rules around how these buildings get designed, right? There's rules around, and there's accountability on the end, right? People who call themselves engineers and architects build these buildings. And if these buildings fall apart and these buildings hurt people, people could lose their license or people could be held accountable. And we have a whole industry in tech where people can have these titles of building things and have to have no accountability for the impact. So yes, something can be big and something can be small, but if you don't have sort of rules at the heart of sort of the design process, and then accountability on the back end to sort of create the dynamics that people have to sort of hold themselves to, then even if you keep things small, you could have a whole bunch of small networks of white supremacists who are creating, clubs to then go out and do violence. And it could be small and still have a lot of damage and do a lot of damage. And so what I guess I want to speak to is sort of what is at the heart of how we hold an industry that has so much potential to bring us into the future, but is dragging us into a past because of all the ways in which the incentive structures, the violence algorithms, the sort of, as Jesse said, sort of this idea of growth at all costs, growth and profit at the sort of expense of safety, integrity, security, and all the other things that industries across the board have to hold themselves to in some way, shape, or form.
While we're talking a bit about like those incentives and how large tech companies operate, Rashad, with Color Change, something really interesting about the organization is it didn't begin, as a tech accountability organization. Color Change integrated its work in the tech industry into its existing work, and it has a really broad mission. It addresses things like voter suppression, policing reform, everything. I was wondering if, based on those kind of dual perspectives, like operating both in the tech world and in a number of other industries, if you've noticed any like attitudinal differences in how tech considers itself when you're working with the tech industry versus, say, Coca-Cola or whoever else.
It's complicated. First of all, we operate from a theory that people don't experience issues, they experience life. That the forces that hold us back are deeply interrelated. That a racist criminal justice system requires a racist media culture to create the demands. Political inequality goes hand in hand with economic inequality and vice versa. That a hostile climate for communities is not just something you can solve by hitting an issue over here. And so while we did not start as a tech accountability, we started as a racial justice organization in the aftermath of a flood, which was Hurricane Katrina, caused by bad decision makers that turned into a life-altering disaster by bad decision makers, with Black folks on their roofs begging for the government to do something and literally left to die. And the thing that about Katrina that's really important, that sort of animates our theory of change and really connects your question, is that Katrina illustrated things that people already knew: geographic segregation, generational poverty, the impacts of what we've done to our planet, all the ways in which structural racism undergirds underinvestment, disinvestment, targeting of communities. But at the heart of Katrina, no one was nervous about disappointing Black people. Government, corporations, media, right? And so if you think about the tech world and people building platforms, right? You think about the head of Zoom saying after the sort of earlier days of the pandemic, when all the Zoom bombing was happening, that they never imagined that people would want to interrupt someone's gathering. Well, you could not imagine that if that's not your sort of like experience of having sort of your gatherings, of having your sort of coming togethers interrupted or disrupted. And so to the extent that our mandate, right, is to force institutions to be nervous about disappointing us, to bring about change to the areas that impact Black people's lives, that's important. But I do think that in Silicon Valley, and in the tech world in general, there's, I think, a tendency for people to be maybe a lot more impressed with themselves and impressed with their politics and impressed with their sort of like ability to believe in something bigger, right? And not think of themselves the way that, you know, sometimes it's a lot easier to deal with a Coca-Cola where like I go in and I know that these people think that they're making soda, not making like a new society for all of us. And I can like deal with the impacts of something that they're doing, and we can all be on the same page because they don't think that they should get a Nobel Peace Prize. But in tech world, like people think that we can code our way out of structural racism, when in fact the code is just amplifying structural racism. And so it becomes a lot harder. The quick thing I will just say is that, you know, in the aftermath of the killing of Trayvon Martin and all the voter ID laws spreading, we had this very major campaign against the American Legislative Exchange Council, which was behind, otherwise known as ALEC, which was behind Stand Your Ground laws, which was behind voter ID. We got a lot of corporations, at the end, probably over 150 corporations to divest. It was all over the news, right? We had like gotten them, and we started getting corporations who cared about the environment, who cared about justice, all these things to divest from ALEC. In the middle of the Zimmerman trial, a whole bunch of Silicon Valley companies joined ALEC because they thought that it was going to help them on some law that was happening in California that was going to create more accountability. The fact that they didn't have anyone around the table that said, hey, yo, we might still want to work on this law, but we probably shouldn't join this group that people are like protesting over like the killing of Trayvon Martin and the Stand Your Ground laws that shielded George Zimmerman, is sort of an example of how these companies, as large as they become, as powerful as they become, have a lack of depth in terms of the real world and how race, gender, inequality all sort of impacts people's outcomes.
While we're talking a bit about like what you said about kind of tech being ahistorical by nature and sort of blindsided by these issues that are systemic, they've been around forever, they're manifesting in new ways. Jesse, I would love to ask you, I'm sure that you've been asked this before, but in 2016, you were working on Hillary Clinton's campaign for president. I would love to know, in hindsight, being perfectly honest, looking back with the experiences that you had, did you see some of this stuff on the horizon, you know, like the conspiracies, QAnon, misinformation? What could you see and what couldn't you see from your perspective where you were?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think that there's no doubt we had a lot of discussions about like, how do you manage? I mean, Hillary Clinton comes with, I love the woman with all my heart. She carries more baggage from, 40 years of disinformation, predating Facebook and all that, has been targeted at her. And then, you faced a uniquely, I don't think that Donald Trump was necessarily an aberration, but so much as the culmination of years of Republican Party moving toward more outright discriminatory racial appeals and just bigotry. And we had to deal with all sorts of debates internally, which is like, how are people going to react if we call Donald Trump a racist? How are people going to react if Hillary Clinton is the first presidential candidate to call her opponent a racist in modern times? Like, how do we address? I think she gave a big speech about the alt-right, which at the time I think was pretty groundbreaking. At the same time, looking back on it, I wish we wouldn't have called it the alt-right, which is like this sanitized version of what it really is, which is like white supremacy. And so when you talk about, did I see QAnon coming? Probably not. But did I see this like horrifying crawl toward more and more explicit, racism that's always been there, obviously, but had been sort of at least relegated to the corner in some sense, where people at least didn't feel okay being out and out about it, like out and out racists, like proud to be out in the open, being part of these kinds of communities. That we definitely saw that on the horizon, and I don't think we necessarily grappled with it the right way. I think we did I don't know. It was a really challenging thing to try to navigate at the time, but I very much felt like something really ugly is coming. And I definitely poured every hour of my waking time during those year and a half into that campaign, in part because I was like terrified of where the country was headed if we didn't win the election. And everything and more that I feared has definitely come to fruition.
While we're doing a bit of looking back, it's simplistic to say, oh, this is where it all went wrong with social media platforms. Like it could have been different from the start because, as Rashad was saying, there's intentionality that maybe wasn't there in the beginning, as we're seeing now. Naj, I would love to talk to you a little bit more about the model of what you're working on, because it's just completely different. Ethel's Club is, I think it's $16.99 a month, I think is right. And it's a paid subscription. People want to be involved in the community. They sign up and they pay monthly and they get to engage. It might be overly simplistic, but do you think that there's an argument that social media being free, by which I mean being ad supported, the user is the product, is where it all went wrong, arguably? And do you think that social networks need to stop being free, like you've chosen to do, to realign those incentives?
Yeah, I don't think the issues we're seeing come from the internet and social platforms being free. I think it's deep, embedded, systemic problems, as Rashad mentioned, that have haunted this country since day zero. I think the people that are creating these platforms are creating what they know, which is to create patriarchal, systems that live within platforms that look glossy and have illustrations and use fun, human-centric language, but at the heart of it, don't make space for what marginalized communities feel on those platforms. And so I think that's just embedded in almost every platform we use. As Rashad mentioned, we've got Zoom, which I don't think you would consider a social platform, but the fact that they didn't recognize that there are people who want to purely cause terror to Black people and people of color for fun, it is a big issue. And with Somewhere Good specifically, and also with Ethel's Club, all we've done is say, we know what that is like, and so we're simply creating an alternative. Whether that alternative is free or paid, I think is a much larger discussion. Ethel's Club is obviously paid, and as a member, you get access to a community centered around holistic wellness. It's incredibly specific. With Somewhere Good, it will be a free platform, but the things that we're doing differently are we're taking moderation and safety incredibly seriously from the beginning. Before we had a feature, Trello board for like audio or video, we were talking about how do you build consent between two parties on the platform? How do you, make reporting something that is accessible and quick and not something where you're forcing someone to relive a horror and or go through some sort of long process where they maybe have to call a number? How do you get in front of these issues that my team, which is composed of Black people, Latinx people, Asian American people, queer people, non-binary people, the things that we experience every single moment of being online, and sort of a larger explanation of that, right? That can be Tumblr, it can be Twitter, it can almost be, again, every platform. All the things that we've lived through, we are saying, what if we didn't have to? And what does that take to create that kind of platform? And so we are constantly throttled with questions of, interactions we're having now, interactions we've had in the past. And that's sort of what's driving us to make a better platform, not necessarily the financial difference of something having a cost behind it or being free.
I'm glad that you brought up moderation. That's actually something really striking about Ethel's Club and moderation is that on the site, when you go on, it says there's a zero tolerance policy. We don't allow any ists or isms, which is great. And I'd be curious, has that played out in any kind of nuanced moderation discussions so far? I'm not saying have you all had any issues? Has anything gone wrong? But I'd just love to know what those conversations look like and how for Somewhere Good, how that's going to work with the moderators that'll kind of be appointed to those communities.
Yeah, I mean, we take moderation incredibly seriously. Again, before we even knew what the product was that we were trying to sell people, we knew that it had to feel safe and sort of highly moderated, top down in that manner. We have not had any issues, and this is me knocking on wood, to this day over this past year. And I think a lot of that is because we do cause some friction through user experience upon their onboarding. I know that if we're talking sort of traditional product building language, you try to make it as simple for people to just sign up and kind of be thrown into a room and they're given their pedestal and they can shout. We actually like to put up walls and make people kind of jump through hurdles, because it's important that the people who are spending their time in our communities want to be there and understand the implications of what it means to be a part of that community. And so if it means you have to read through 12 guidelines and actually mark off every single one, that's what has to happen. In terms of the events that we do with Uplands Club, we send out sort of guidelines to talent even. So anyone who comes into our space understands what we've built and the importance of following the rules that we've placed. And so, I mean, I can talk all day about moderation. I'm constantly thinking about ways to make it stronger, make it, better. But I do think it sort of boils down to the fact that we've done a great job of zoning in on who our end user is. And so that when people find us, they're like, I've been looking for this super curated and moderated place online for a long time. And so we haven't had too many issues there.
That's such a special experience of having users finally find the thing that they've been looking for. So that's really great to hear.
Yeah.
I guess Jesse and Rashad, I would be curious to know, to get a little bit into the policy discussion. What Naj is talking about, moderation, having a thoughtful moderation from the beginning. Obviously, major social platforms are still struggling, still haven't devoted enough resources to taking things like racist hate seriously, to taking things like harassment, misinformation, everything seriously. These problems are ongoing. I would be curious to know, of the kind of platter of policy solutions that are out there in 2021, things like Section 230, state and federal antitrust suits, bills targeting more specific stuff like algorithms. Which of those solutions seem most promising to you all? And will any of them really have an impact when you can fine a company $5 billion and it just brushes it off?
Well, that's a big question, because we do actually have to deal with the fact that the FTC, the fines are things that these companies can simply write off and don't actually provide the type of pain necessary. Some of these companies need to be broken up. Some of these companies need to be regulated in deeper ways. Some of these companies, that Section 230 we need a reform of Section 230 that actually both holds civil rights principles, but also kind of deals with the fact of targeted marketing on these platforms and the sort of ways in which the companies can, wipe their hands of it. We need some sort of CFPB, FDA version of infrastructure at the government level, because anyone who has watched some of the hearings knows that the hearings on nuclear power, or even keeping our milk safe, would look the same if we didn't actually have government infrastructure. People who we elect, to be in Congress or Senate can't be experts on all these issues. And so part of having that infrastructure is the same way I talked about having buildings that meet code. It's not because of our elected officials or experts. It's because we build the infrastructure at the government level, and that we actually have fines and accountability that's at scale to make sure that there's consequences. So I think all of those things are going to be necessary. Whether or not we have the political power is really the question. And right now, what all of us should know is clear is that we're going to need a lot more people involved in raising their voices if we're going to win any real change that's possible to be helpful to make change. We will lose time and time in the back rooms because of the power of Silicon Valley, because of their money, because of how complicated these issues may feel. We will lose in the back rooms if we do not have millions of people lined up at the front door. And part of lining people up the front doors is centering racial and gender justice in these issues, recognizing the motivational role that communities will have to play in reshaping the rules of tech.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with everything Rashad said there. I was going to say, when you were ticking through the list of policy options, sort of, yes, like we need all of these things. And it gets back to something Rashad said earlier, which is the fundamental incentive structure around large social media platforms right now is so perverse. They are incentivized to amplify the most toxic content, disinformation, hate speech. Like, that stuff drives engagement. And so long as they have platforms where they have no accountability, through we talk about Section 230 reform, like there's no way to hold them liable from a legal standpoint. The FTC is not hitting them with fines that really hurt them. They don't have, and there's just no friction anywhere. And so, like, the more engagement, the better for them. And I don't know, Rashad, how you put up with continuing to like meet with these people and have them tell you, oh, we don't profit off hate. And it's like, that's just fundamentally not true. I'm trying to censor myself here, but like, they do. Like, Mark Zuckerberg has written posts about how, like, no matter where we set the line, the closer you get to the line, the more engagement it generates, the more sensationalized the content, hate speech, disinformation, conspiracy theories. It generates more engagement, and the longer you're engaged, the more data they can collect about you, and the more advertisements they can show you. And there's just no incentive not to do that. And until we fundamentally upend that incentive structure, they're going to continue profiting off hate and distortion and delusion and discrimination. And that's just the reality. So we need to, the content moderation stuff is very nuanced and very important. And it's like so refreshing to hear someone like Naj who's coming at it from the outset. Like, what kind of community do we want to build? But at this point with companies like Facebook, like, we can't just be talking about content moderation. We need to like change the incentive structure.
That's a great point. Looking big picture at all of that stuff. We have a question from an audience member that I will throw out. And it's actually one I like because it segues into a different question I was curious about. There's some this is my bit, and then I'll get to their bit. But there's some interesting near future stuff going on right now in social media. We've got voice-based platforms, stuff like Discord and Clubhouse, which is very hot right now that people are talking about. Social media is kind of like moving in a different direction trend-wise. So the question from the audience member is, this is so timely given all the hot stuff around Clubhouse. Wondering if social networks that grow more slowly build better and more polite large communities.
I think that, like, once again, this gets to the rules. White nationalist groups can grow slowly. Isn't Roger Stone? Did he just join Clubhouse? Weren't they just hosting him for something the other night? All of this stuff is all heads in the same direction when the incentive structures are off and this sort of goals are off. I think that, yes, we keep trying to figure out a way for racism, for misogyny, for all these things to not seep in. The best way is that we create structures, rules, and accountability. Otherwise, we will end up exactly where we're at right now. We may just end up there a little bit slower, but that doesn't necessarily change the impact on the communities that have to bear the brunt of these platforms, which have created hostile climates for them and their communities.
Thank you. I think unfortunately, this is a huge conversation and we are about out of time for today. I wish we could go on forever, and I'm sure we could. But thank you all so much for your time. We really appreciate it. We loved hearing about what you're building, what you're working on, and imagining a better future for social media that would make all of us, a lot safer, healthier, and happier is always a good thing.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for having us.
Appreciate it.